So let's get started, shall we? And thank you so much, Elena and Sarah and the whole team. I can see that some people, have been mentioning that my audio is a little bit fuzzy. I decided to actually join via phone while still I share via the internet, just to make sure that we don't have any technical difficulties. So that would sacrifice a little bit of the audio quality, but hopefully you'll still be able to hear me perfectly. So let's dive straight into it. Thank you everybody for joining. I'm really excited to dive into a practical guide towards responsible AI. I'm going to cover a lot of different things, so hold your seats. We're going to cover a lot of really interesting topics. And of course, we're going to be, and I'm going to be present throughout the entire session. So I think if you have any questions, I'm on the Discord, and I'm going to be able to answer any specific questions. So specifically in terms of myself, my background is primarily as a practitioner. I have primarily been in various different software engineering hands-on roles, as well as leadership. Right now, I am one of the engineering directors at Seldom Technologies, as well as the chief scientist at the Institute for Ethical AI and Machine Learning. The Institute for Ethical AI is a research center that focuses primarily in highly technical research and primarily builds upon standards to ensure the responsible development of AI and machine learning. And we are part of this organization called the Linux Foundation, as well as contributing to various different other initiatives that ensure the responsible development of AI. Also, the company that I'm currently working on, Seldon, primarily has a open source machine learning framework that is currently used with over 2 million downloads to be able to deploy and productionize machine learning models across various use cases, across very different set of industries. Before I actually dive in, I do have some small requests. I have some action points that I want all of the attendees to do. I want to remind you all that mentors are here to help. Remember that you can actually bother us, and you can actually ask for as much as we can throughout the entire time that we're here. So please do ask for questions. Please do send us direct messages. I have seen already a few of you that have done that, but this is an opportunity to really just ask questions and interact. Remember that the technology part is also only a small piece of the puzzle and the solution. So make sure that you take that into account as you build those solutions forward. And this is the core thing. Make sure that whilst you're building your solution, you try to identify what is the minimum amount of things that you can build during this very short period of time that will allow you to showcase your vision. Because that's what it's all about in this very short amount of time, is for you to identify the things that can allow you to showcase that vision. And the most important one is, please remember to have fun and learn, right? So you're actually spending your weekend to go through this. The least that you can do is to ensure that you're having fun, that you're making sure that you're meeting as many people and learning as much as possible. So let's dive straight into it. And there's specific one thing that probably has been mentioned a few times. The challenge that we're facing with COVID is a challenge, if not the biggest of our generation. It's having massive societal impacts in terms of the people that it's affecting, not only from a physical perspective, but also from a mental health perspective and from a long-lasting impact. This is also having an economic impact across various different sectors. This is affecting things like travel, retail, to the point where projections are showing massive amounts of costs. Long story short, I don't need to emphasize and to just put into words the fact that it's such a big challenge. But one of the things to remember, and this is a very interesting piece, that this could potentially not be the last and biggest of the challenges that we'll have to face in this generation. One of the interesting metrics that has come out is that the impact that COVID has had in industries and travel in terms of carbon emissions specifically has shown that this is the level of push, of course not to the same rate because the rate of decrease is very, very big, but it just shows how big this challenge of carbon emissions is in order for us to be able to stay in track with the required targets. So it is important to make sure that, yes, it's a massive challenge and we're tackling it, but all of the implications that come with it are also long-lasting, not only from this perspective. And of course, we are in this Teens in AI event with the promise of AI. We believe that AI has a massive potential to be able to have a lot of impact in the current challenges that people are facing in their day-to-day life. One of the things that, again, it doesn't need re-emphasis, that AI has increased in growth, in adoption in industry and in solutions. So that is, preaching to the choir, because you guys are here with that premise in mind. But one of the things that is very, very important to remember is that if you're running around with a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? And in the whole sort of like a spectrum of problems in the world, and the subset of relevant solutions, only a very small percent, well, not very small percentage, but only a percentage of that is tech-specific solutions. And from that, a smaller percentage even is AI solutions. So it's important to make sure that there is that level of approach to ensure we can use the technology to change the world, but at the same time, there's a lot of emphasis that needs to be put to understand what are the real challenges that actually need AI to be solved, and not other challenges that are actually just, perhaps, a bunch of if statements, or more specifically, not even an app, right, can solve. So that's actually quite key. And the reason why that's very important is because the impact of a bad solution can have worse repercussions than no solution at all, right? And that's a very, very important thing to emphasize, not in the context of this hackathon, of course, but in the context of a solution that is deployed across thousands of people. And we're starting to see cases where that will be the case, like with the contact tracing apps, like with the dashboards that the National Health Service are building in this country and other countries. The access to this data, of course, will be critical and will be urgent, but it's not about urgency versus best practice, but it's urgency and best practice. It's how do you make sure that you follow best practices around this specific use case. And the piece around here, and I mentioned a few of the challenges, deep fakes. You have seen algorithmic bias, adversarial attacks, mass surveillance. I could go into a 60 to 3-hour workshop on each of these topics and even more. But of course, this doesn't need even an emphasis, as there is full awareness of the challenges of that. And even on top of that, the complexity of machine learning as a technology introduces a lot of things that we hadn't had to deal before. The challenge of specialized hardware, of complex computational graphs, the challenges of compliance to make sure that you have the audit trails or the accountability processes behind that. And the ability to reproduce something, right? If you have a solution and you say, hey, this is something that I feel could actually help society, and it works in a petri dish, but if you deploy it into the real world, you need to make sure that the ability to have that reproducibility of both production level and experiment, is quite critical. And as I have emphasized a couple of times, it's key to go beyond the algorithms, right? When it comes to AI, the machine learning and the artificial intelligence piece is only a small subset of the pieces that are required to address a problem. This is basically the intersection of the machine learning expertise, but also the industry domain expertise, the policy expertise, the industry standards. And this requires, as much as it needs the researchers and the technologists, as it does for the designers, the people with the different business skills, and even with the social sciences, all over the whole spectrum, right? And this cross-sector collaboration is what allows for real solutions to come forward. And the key thing here to also remember is that this is not just an approach where you can say, I am going to follow the high-level principles, guidelines, and then automatically everything gets resolved, right? Because ultimately, it's about making sure that you have the right high-level ethical principles or the right level of high-level approaches to the problem, but it's equally critical to make sure that the underlying engine, the underlying technology, has the infrastructure or the capabilities in place to make sure that reality matches expectation, right? Because we can have long 2-hour discussions about how we all agree that doing harm is bad, how we all agree that that algorithmic bias is bad. But the reality is that until we can actually build the underlying solutions that can make sure that reality matches expectation, we're not going to be able to fulfill these challenges. So it's an end-to-end problem where it starts with the right initial principles, but then it has to be reflected around the best practices. And then there's also the question that comes in. We have hosted a lot of discussions in this topic, which has been massively fascinating. The question of whose ethics, right? A lot of the times we mention, okay, well, you need to make sure that you talk about ethics and that you introduce the best practices and principles by design. But then it still has the question of, which underlying philosophical foundations are being followed, right? Because when it comes to different societies, these societies have tens of thousands of years of human history before this last, 20 years or the last few generations. And these tens of thousands of years of foundational knowledge have actually built cultures and societies how they are now. One thing to make sure that it's worth emphasizing is that the philosophical foundations of a culture or a nation do not reflect one-to-one the political state of the country itself, right? I mean, that's one of the things to bear in mind. But understanding those underlying knowledge foundations allows people to empathize much better, to see where the other people are coming from, and then being able to have much more productive discussions. And the way that we have approached it with the work that we have done at the Institute is by taking that top-bottom approach, or that bottom-up approach as well. And we have started with what we refer to as the 8 principles for responsible development, deployment, and operation of artificial intelligence. These are 8 principles that apply primarily for delivery teams that consist of cross-functional backgrounds to ensure that they're at least conscious of things that they're doing throughout the machine learning project lifecycle. Things like human augmentation, bias evaluation, explainability by justification, etc., etc. Those are things that we have structured to ensure it can be adopted by individuals or teams when running the projects from a more practical perspective to ensure that they can evaluate things. Because one of the things that we believe is that it's not about embedding ethics into the algorithms, because that is ultimately absolutely impossible. What is required is to introduce those best practices, those ethics, those principles through process and through human touch points. What are the specific individuals that need to have a perspective, an opinion, a review at which point in time? So as you're developing your solutions, as you're exploring these solutions, having these things in mind will be quite important. What is the trust and the privacy, the potential security risks? How can this be exploited if we do it, right? And that's important, especially when you're dealing with data that is as critical as patient data, NHS data, or even if it's things like social media data that people have thought, well, how is my Facebook data going to, potentially be harmful? We have seen that in the last few political situations, right? I think that in itself reflects how important your data is and everyone's as a collective. We have actually also started creating a set of open source projects that you can go off and contribute yourself. One of them is a list of all of the production libraries that you can use for machine learning, and these are available, within this link, and we're going to share the slides later. And similarly, this is taking it from a technical standpoint, but we also have put together another list that tries to map all of the different types of guidelines related to ethical frameworks, ethical checklists, etc., which again you can actually go and check. That's in in the Institute's GitHub, which is at github.com/ethicalml. If there's something that is not there, you can actually submit and contribute. You can get involved. So that's one of the core benefits. We have also done a few other things like procurement frameworks that can be adopted by industries as a whole and industry suppliers and players to ensure that the way that they do projects are in the best practices and within following some of these best principles. This is basically following a machine learning maturity model, which I'm not going to dive into because I don't want you to fall asleep. But at the same time, it's definitely one of the areas that is available there for you to actually go and read if you think this is as interesting as we do. And just to kind of like finish off, I want to just run through a very brief case study that will showcase what does actual algorithmic bias looks like. And what we're going to do here is we're going to take a domain expert evaluation process where people are going to want to automate the approval or rejection of loans. So if you go and apply for a loan, they want to introduce an algorithm, let's say, to either approve or reject it automatically, right? And what we're going to be looking at is how algorithmic bias is actually introduced in this area. And we're going to follow the usual data science structure. In this case, we have the training data, the transforming data for input of the model, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, I am very conscious that I'm covering a lot of these different topics very, very fast. We actually have, half an hour, 1 hour sessions on each of the chunks in YouTube, or on each of the chunks of this presentation. So if you're curious on one of these areas or you want to understand more about a specific area like this use case, you'll be able to actually dive into it and learn a bit more about it. So now in terms of the process that we're going to be doing, so I'm not going to go into that much detail, but the way that it's going to look like is we have a bunch of examples of people that have submitted loans and whether the loans have been approved or rejected. We're going to actually build a model from this data set, which basically will tell us whether the models are, whether a new loan is approved or rejected. That's basically what it's going to do. As a data scientist, you would first run this through a model, and what you would obtain is an accuracy. And in this case, when we run it for the first time, we would see that, we get a 99% accuracy, right? And you would think, oh my God, right? So I trained the model and straight away I got 99% accuracy. That's amazing. I should be able to put it in production, right? But when we actually look at the results and break them down into a little bit more insight, we would be able to see that the results in themselves were actually just rejecting loans, right? So then there's the question of, well, how could we get 99% accuracy if the model is only rejecting loans? And this perhaps could be a use case that you could have in reality. The reason here is because the data that we used to train it actually consisted of mostly rejected loans with only about 5 or 10 loans that were actually approved, right? So in that case, if the model was to just reject all the models, it would still get a 99% accuracy, right? So in that perspective, it's important, it's critical to make sure that you understand what your actual data looks like. Because in production, we can see that there are supposed to be some models that were supposed to actually, be approved. So in this case, we basically trained a model that just rejects all loans. And in that case, it's a loan that is currently discriminating to everybody, right? In that case, in this specific case. So in essence, what you see in terms of algorithmic bias often tends to be introduced like that. And of course, this is a very, very simplified use case, but ultimately, I encourage you, we have another talk where we actually dive into details and we cover the data science behind it, but for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into that. But I do encourage you to have a look and check out all of those things. So with that said, I've covered quite a lot of content in a very, very short period of time. I encourage you more than anything to, again, go and bother the mentors, ask us questions. Of course, try to explore as much as you can, and then, of course, have fun. But I'll be available all weekend, so feel free to, drop me a message on Discord, and, I'll be happy to point you in the right direction.